Okay, hello and welcome to another edition of Afterthoughts, where we ask the philosophical question, is hindsight really 2020? This week we are joined by Charles Peterson, who has been absent from the show for a bit. So to welcome him back, Charles, do you have a drink order? Do you have any rants or raves? You could even have a rant and a rave since it's been so long.
I'm glad to be back. This is really fantastic. I'm hurt though. I was expecting the theme song from Welcome Back, Cotter, slightly edited to insert my name, but I'll overlook that.
Do you want that by Julia Kristeva? Because I could produce that right now.
I'm dying for that. I'm dying for that. So I will order a drink in celebration of 18th Street Brewery, my favorite brewer from Gary, Indiana, the only brewer in Gary, Indiana. I'm having a mango shaved ice. It is a Berliner style ale. And because we're on video, I can hold that up for the camera. So very tasty. I'm not a huge beer person, but these sours I've just gotten into are so tasty, so good. So it is a mango shaved ice from the 18th Street Brewery in Gary, Indiana. That
18th Street, call us.
Yes, please do. Do I have a rant? There's so many things I can rant or rave about.
Why am I not surprised?
Because I've been holding them in since the last season.
Listen.
But I am going to rave about being here with my three friends, with my podcast in arms. So the community is great. Seeing Lee and Rick and Jason. I'm so excited. I'm on the verge of calling Rick and Lee Rickley, creating a new adverb just for the two of you. So I hope things go really Rickley today.
It could be like Rick Jason Lee.
Rick Jason Lee. Oh, that's even better. That's fantastic.
Sounds a little bit like a serial killer. I'm sorry. Somehow you feel like that. It sounds like a serial killer.
Ricky Jason Lee kept to himself. He didn't really have any friends, but he was such a quiet boy. This is
Rick Jason Lee has a fat FBI file, is what I'm trying to say.
So I'm raving about being back with the three of you and being back on the podcast.
Well, welcome, old friend.
Yeah, welcome back, man. All right, Jason.
All right, so
what are we doing today?
We're talking about, first we're talking about materialism. The first episode up to be rethought and to be thought or afterthought, because we haven't heard what Charles has to say about it at all. So I don't know where we want to begin. Does anyone have a place they want to jump in?
I have one place, and this is more of an apology than anything else, but as much as I do not like either object-oriented ontology or speculative realism, I think I gave that philosophical position shorter shrift than even it deserves. And it is slightly more complicated than I indicated. I said it's basically the position that there's stuff out there and no other philosopher ever thought that before. And I think in the end it is that position, but I think the way especially Quentin Meillassoux gets there is a little bit more complicated than that. It has to do with eliminating the requirement that reality be reflected in consciousness, and therefore giving a priority to knowability over the reality of things, and yada yada yada. So I felt really bad about re-listening to that. Well, I felt bad because I sounded a little dumb, I think.
Did someone get in touch with you? Is there someone in the room with you now? Blink twice if you're safe.
Hey, but speaking of Rick sounding dumb, Rick, early on in the conversation in that episode, you mentioned that to say something like stuff is only matter, or matter is just stuff. Sorry. Matter is just stuff is equivalent to saying shit happens. And you quoted Aristotle as saying like, that's the equivalent of saying like all is from night. I think
right.
Hegel would say like the night in which all cows are black, right? But then you went on to say that the only thing that maybe this is not an exact quote, but I think that you went on to say that the only thing that matter could mean, if it's going to avoid being an idealism, or, and I know this is a quote, or worse in your words, and theology,
right,
is that matter has to be that which is without thought. And I guess, like, you know, when I was listening back to it, that seemed to me to be in tension with your admission that you like are a materialist. Like, since what you meant by that is that your focus is on the importance of the concept of matter and its relations, which sounds like, as you said, you know, like in my previous quote, like the night in which all cows are black, or turning materialism into an idealism or worse. So,
yeah, well,
so yeah, like justify yourself, please.
No pressure. No pressure.
So there's this incredibly important book called The Thought of Matter, and it's available on Amazon.com.
Oh, who wrote that?
Or through Roman and Littlefield's website. And, you know, if maybe 50 of you
Rick wrote that, for people who didn't get my joke. Rick wrote that.
Well, and if 50 of you buy it, I might break the threshold at which Roman and Littlefield will actually cut a check for my royalties.
Wait, is that 50 more people or just 50 people?
49, Charles, because my mom has one.
Come on, hotel bar podcast listeners. Let's help Rick earn his 5 cents.
So anyhow, my position briefly is this, that in order to avoid materialism just being a positing, right? I just say that whatever is matter. Recognizing what we discussed during that episode, namely that the task of philosophy seems to be, it deals in thought, it thinks things, and so on. And so whatever matter has to be would emerge from the way in which we do a sort of immanent or internal critique of the way in which our thought works, and recognize that within our thinking itself, there is something that has an element of non-thought. And this is my way of just repeating basically one of the main themes of Adorno's negative dialectics. And so I sort of adopt that and try to then figure out what the implications of that are, and then the ways in which the history of philosophy grapples with this business that we call matter, and then also materialism. And I end up, and this is part of my afterthoughts, I end up with something Jason was emphasizing throughout that episode, namely on the fact that materialism, I think, has its biggest impact and biggest import in terms of a social and political theory more than as a metaphysics.
Can I say Go ahead, Charles.
I was going to say, and this is a callback to a previous season, because when I heard this conversation and I heard Rick's arguments, I thought, but aren't you a metaphysician? Wasn't that something? Did I make that up? Did I imagine all of that conversation?
You did not.
No, I am a metaphysician.
Of course, because all things can be answered through saying, I am a metaphysician.
Wait, this is an episode of Afterthoughts, not Pile on Rick.
But I just want to throw that in there. Please, Jason.
Yeah, that actually touches on what I was thinking after I listened to the episode again. And I left that episode thinking there was something of a tension between two different meanings of materialism. There's sort of materialism in a kind of Marxist sense, which emphasizes the socio-historical positioning of thought, the idea that you can't see the ground from which you speak, that you're always situated in ways that exceed your understanding of that situation. And then materialism as a kind of everything is matter, a kind of metaphysical position. And I feel like we were kind of a little bit talking around that schism of two different meanings of materialism. There's materialism as a kind of almost a socio-historical critique of philosophy in general, and materialism as a position within philosophy. And those both get called materialism, but I'm not sure, after listening, I'm not sure they are really the same thing.
Yeah.
And they may be in some sense at odds, because the first one, the socio-historical critique, isn't really interested in a metaphysics and doesn't really answer some of the questions that someone might have for a metaphysics of matter. And the second one, the matter as metaphysics position, might not be interested in some of the same sort of questions about the socio-historical position of philosophy that the other kind of material. So there's like two different kinds of materialism at work in that conversation.
Yeah, Jason, I really appreciated your focus in that conversation following Marx on material relations instead of, material itself. And actually, you mentioned this quote by Pascal, like, if you kneel down and move your lips, you will believe. Yeah. And I've been meaning to ask you this. And I mean, like, I have your phone number. I could have texted you and asked you this, but I didn't. But like, that quote has really stuck with me since. And like, where is that quote from? Like, what is the context of that quote?
Oh, well, it's, I mean, I don't know exactly about the context of it from Pascal. I did look it up once, but I'm familiar familiar with it from Althusser. Cites it in his famous essay on on ideology, in which, he's basically making it clear that he wants to reverse the relationship between ideas and practices, rather than think ideology as an idea you have and then you go through and have these practices. He wants to suggest that the practices come first and more or less situate the ideas. So he tells this story because, like, Althusser, like, I think, had Pascal with him when he was in the prison camp and like read Pascal a lot. But Pascal, tells a story of a priest advising someone who was doubting and said, just go through the motions, fake it till you make it, basically.
Yeah.
Right.
Kneel down and you will believe that practices situate thought. Thought doesn't situate practices, which is another version of that quote from Marx. Life determines consciousness. Consciousness does not determine life. And by the way, I think the person we gave a real short shrift to on that episode were idealists. Afterwards, my father, who's a fan of the show, listened and has bought my book as well. He listened and he said, "What's an idealist?" And I tried to sort of explain, and he said, "Why would anyone think that?" Like my father left the show thinking materialism was clearly the right way to go about things. That to believe that ideas shape and determine things just seemed like hopelessly head in the clouds. So I don't know. I don't know if I can do justice to that right now, but I feel like we owe idealists more of an apology than object-oriented ontology. Or at least I feel like I do.
They'll get their turn.
They'll get their turn.
I do not sign on to that apology.
I mean, like, I find that like so strange. Like, my experience listening back to that episode was the exact opposite, that we basically ended up collapsing materialism into some kind of, like, disingenuous idealism in every instance. So, yeah, I mean, I guess, good on us for like selling the title of the episode, but like that was not my experience listening back to it. Yeah, I don't know.
Can I say about this two kinds of materialism? In the back of my mind, always when I'm thinking about these questions, is my argument that Engels begins a whole host of bad readings of Marx. And one of the bad readings of Marx is to actually try to collapse materialism as a metaphysical position in with the social and historical and political materialism. And so I always so one of the reasons I focus on the metaphysical materialism is to show how bankrupt that is, as someone like Engels would put it, in order to then open up what's going on with the other kind of materialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think the historical materialism is the only materialism that makes sense to me. I mean, just full disclosure.
Yeah.
I think it, like, as you said, Rick, or, I mean, I don't know if you're actually committed to this position or not, but like, as you said, like, any other kind of materialism ends up being an idealism or or worse, a theology.
Yeah.
I wanted to say that I really appreciated Jason's points during the conversation, especially to the turn to what he's elucidated now in terms of like this distinction, right? In terms of what types of materialism are being discussed. Because as I was sort of listening and I was positioning myself in this conversation, my thinking is always, my commitment to materialism is one that's very, very invested in questions of agency, questions of tangibility. What's the intention of a certain type of materialism? And that is to be able to alter, to organize, to evolve, right, consciously surrounding. So, and this is not a new thing, but clearly I was not interested at all in the metaphysical sort of approach to this, but I do appreciate Rick's project of showing the bankruptcy of that, right? I mean, I can't separate materialism from certain types of struggle. For me, investing in that allows for me to read sort of this vast materialist tradition across really the 20th century and certainly the type of politics and political movements and political thinkers that I'm invested in. Yeah. So I thought maybe a bit more, I would appreciate that being much more explicit in the conversation, but I do appreciate that Jason did open up the door for that.
Yeah, Charles, I mean, one of the things I was thinking, listening back to it, and also knowing that you were going to join us for this Afterthoughts conversation, was that in the 4 seasons that, you co-hosted with Rick and I on Hotel Bar Sessions, like one of the things that became abundantly clear to me was that you believed that matter just kind of is what is laid on top of something more transcendent. I mean, ideas might be like not the right word for it or whatever, but like that matter was a epiphenomenon, I don't know, of like ideas or something else, like as Rick would say, or worse, theology. And it seems really clear to me in that episode that Rick was trying to say the opposite, that like at the end of the day, it's just like there's something inexplicable, uncognizable underneath ideas that is matter. And I'm just like, I just want to give you a chance to, just like pick a fight with Rick.
Fight. When did the fight end?
Charles
ding ding round 3.
Charles calls me about once a week and he's like, now listen.
I mean, it may be something I'm still trying to work through it in terms of my own thinking, and certainly in my previous incarnation as a podcaster, transcendence was an idea, was something that I engaged, and I guess I'm still trying to work through how does that fit into my more sort of materialistic intentions and investment. I don't have an answer for that right now, but I recognize that it is a challenge for me that I'm trying to hold on to both. Maybe it's a mistake to think that transcendence is necessarily disconnected from, right? And maybe how do we think through transcendence happening within sort of this particular materialist engagement?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I mean, again, just on re-listening, I thought that like ultimately what Jason was articulating, which is like, what we mean by materialism is a, reckoning with the actual practices and relations, like material things. I mean, like humans are only one among those many material things, but it just made me think like, yeah, that seems closer to me to like what, Charles was always emphasizing,
babbling about, yammering on about. And I would say that also I did appreciate the introduction of the context of the Anthropocene into the conversation as well. Yeah, I think that was a really nice step in the conversation.
Well, maybe we should move on to influencers. So our next episode, so this was episode 84, 85. Somebody help me out here. But at any rate, the next episode that we're doing our afterthoughts about today is our episode on influencers.
83.
So 83. Sorry. I was way off. All right. So let's just start with you, Charles. Like, what did you think about our episode on influencers?
I had to catch sort of my last millennium old man sort of sensibility in terms of thinking about the rise of these figures within our culture. And first of all, was Guy Debord mentioned at all? I think someone may have made a reference to Debord in terms of
no.
For me, there was a place for a conversation about Debord and all of that. And what was key for me is understanding the influencer as being someplace in between. And I think Lee brought this up, people who just had influence, right? Whose particular style, their approach to a particular topic, or their way of being, right, was such that struck people in such a fashion where they wanted to, right, imitate or be like that person. Rick brought up the Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy sort of example of the pillbox hat, or I think, was it Jason brought up the idea of the death of the Homburg came when Kennedy did not wear one during his inauguration. So those are people that had influence. But then you have like the celebrity endorsement, right? The overt utilization of one's fame and cultural capital in order to push a product up on the public. And I don't know why I kept thinking about Robert Mitchum. Wasn't he the voice of beef for a while in the 70s and 80s, like in a commercial? Right? And you knew it was Robert Mitchum because Robert Mitchum's voice was so distinctive, and it was associated with the tough guyness that Jason talked about, and meat is. So you have that, but the influencer is sort of this, I think, this dishonest sort of being in the midst of that, because they are sort of, it's not this organic style, for example, that they have that's encouraging people to imitate them. It is this very intentional corporate-based manipulation of this sense of authenticity and the double down of the rebranding of the self, right? So are you buying this object, or are you sort of consuming this product because you think it's a good product, or are you doing it because I think you're a good product as a person, and ipso facto, whatever you're using or consuming, I'm going to do the same. So I just think it's such an insidious and frightening phenomenon, the influencer. That's just me. You kids get off my lawn.
I mean, okay, first of all, yeah, you kids get off his lawn, but like, I completely agree with you. I think that like maybe what all three of us like agreed upon in that episode was that the influencer, figure, in at least the social media influencer, involves a kind of self-branding where the brand is authenticity. I think like we all agreed on that. And it sounds like you're agreeing on that too.
Yeah, they're the devil's son-in-law. They're terrible. But
if I could, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say this, and I think someone mentioned like how we don't pay attention to Paris Hilton anymore.
Right.
But we do, because now she's in the Hilton sort of hotel commercials. Right. So she's gone back to the family business, and now she's utilizing the brand she developed as an influence to become now a corporate shill.
But if I could just go back to this point about style. So that came up in the episode because I was like saying about my mother that, she was saying like, oh, like there are these people that call themselves influencers. And I feel turned off when somebody calls themselves an influencer. And her story to me was, I used to recognize people in my high school who were stylish because they were stylish, and not because somebody told me to say that they were stylish. And Rick kind of came back and said, yeah, but so sorry, let me back up like one step. So I said to my mom, yeah, but like the person who you recognize as stylish didn't also have 8 million people at the same time, like every day, that telling you that she was stylish. And Rick came back and said, yeah, because there used to be a time back in Rick's day, there used to be a time when, like when we could just like recognize somebody's style, like just be influenced by somebody's aesthetic presentation, right, and not by like whatever, like social influence that they had. And I've thought about that so much since we recorded this episode. Like, I don't think that's true. I don't think that style is something that is not deeply embedded in, like social relations. Like, I don't think that like, if I recognize somebody's like what we call aesthetic style as, I don't know, like imitable or, like something I like even, I don't think that I would call it style, and like to call it style is to reference a whole community of people, right? Like who may or may not have the same aesthetic influence.
Well, I didn't hear myself say it in exactly that way in the episode. And if I did, I'll take it back. Rather, what I was trying to say was that someone, and I think this is where the Jackie Bouvier Kennedy example came up, that obviously she had social influence, right? But that the imitation of her style was not based on the fact that she was using her social influence in order to promote Chanel suits or pillbox hats, but rather because she was admired socially, her style became one that people then all of a sudden started adopting in ways that they otherwise wouldn't have. Because she seemed fancy to a lot.
But you also told the story about The Devil Wears Prada, where you said like, like, here's the thing, like people think that style is, like just about repeating something that you've seen in other influential people. But in fact, like it's this thing that has been constructed over and over and over. And I mean, I guess like, I think that like, they're like style is like all the way down. It's turtles all the way down. Like it's influence all the way down, Well,
but also I think we need to acknowledge that Jackie O or Bouvier or Kennedy at any stage of her life, she could have a relationship to designers that I can't have because I don't have the money to pay them to make me something that I say, this is how I want to look. Yeah. And she did, right? She would go and, for the inauguration, she had gowns made specifically for her and, so on. And so there's a moment, and then that becomes repeated by, all sorts of the Chanel company and then other, I don't know even if we call them designers, but things you could buy then in JCPenney would then be mimicking this fashion that Jackie O had the ability, because she had money, to say, make me look like this. And I don't have that ability. And so I have to take what's on the rack. But if there's a designer listening, call me. I'd be really
Well, I mean, and I know this is a conversation about the episode of influencers, but to pursue this, but we're talking about style only within this sort of elite sort of stratosphere, right? Style can exist in a multitude of places, and people's ability to influence outside of being influencers can, think punk rock, right? No one is saying, I'm going to wear these Doc Martens because I want 40,000 other kids in London to wear Doc Martens too. I'm wearing Doc Martens because this fits a particular need, or it's comfortable, or it's affordable, or it's the most efficient shoe to kick the shit out of somebody on the street, whatever. Right. So the question of style, and I guess from that influence, doesn't necessarily have to be this sort of elite top-down sort of phenomenon. It can spring organically from any sort of space within a social realm.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that came up towards the end of that episode, which I wish we had a little more time for, was precisely this notion that like none of us are free of influence, right? I mean, there's the influencer as a specific socio-historical category derived from the celebrity spokesperson and from a particular sort of a guerrilla advertising campaign dealing with the skepticism people have towards like official advertisements. There's that. But criticizing that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that we are all influence, right? The punk rock is a perfect example of this, right? That in some sense it's a subculture which defines itself by saying we're not going to do what the rest of you do, but they influence each other within that subculture, right? It's just subscribing to a different, smaller scale and different. So even though it is kind of turtles all the way down, there are different kinds of turtles and they're not all doing the same thing. So, you know, and they're not all on the same pond.
And listeners know we're now welcoming our turtleologist. Like what? Like what do you
Turtologist?
Turtologist?
Come on, it's a heptologist, people. Come on.
Oh, well done. Well done. How long have you been waiting to use that term? But I also think that as I was listening to the episode, I thought in an interesting fashion, the existence of the influencer is the recognition, I think you all mentioned this, on the part of sort of the advertising regime of the sophistication of, right, the consumer now. So now the celebrity sort of shill no longer works because people have become either much more cynical about it, or they can see through the transparency of it, or they've developed this Debordian sort of consciousness about what's going on. So now we need a higher level, a much more subtle way by which to begin to sell things. And also, I was hoping to hear someone mention the old book, Subliminal Seduction. I think as a part of this conversation,
I don't
as
know
well.
I don't know this book either. Like, say
it was written by an ad guy who sort of laid out this book and was like, look, this is what's happening in commercials. So, you know, you see a commercial with like a liquor and there's ice in the glass, but sort of what's been shaded into the ice is the word as sex. Like those types of things, like the Plebe Bunny sort of like triggers senses of fertility and desire, right? So it's a whole book laying this out. I forgot the name of the author.
Was that written by Freud's nephew, who was an ad man in the United
States? No, you're thinking Bernays. Bernays wrote the book on propaganda.
Oh yeah,
this was like a late 60s, early 70s work, but it's called Subliminal Seduction. So I was hoping that will be brought into it as well. But I mean, I thought it made me appropriately angry thinking about the extent to which, as a population, we've given over our ability to at least pretend we're making conscious, independent decisions about our consumption.
Can I kind of like turn this in a little bit of a different direction, which is like, I think another thing that we didn't talk about, and of course we didn't talk about because it hadn't happened yet, but like the most recent SCOTUS, Supreme Court, like conversation, like, you know, set of cases has involved like a pretty important case about like, you know, section 320, is it
230?
Yeah, 230. Yeah, like section 230 that like, you know, like gets talked about all the time, which is really about, I mean, depending on what side of the issue you're on, is either about, you know, like obviating social media companies of responsibility from the content that gets posted on their platforms, or encouraging social media companies to monitor the, you know, the content on their platform. But at any rate, like this came up, you know, in a a very significant case about Twitter and Google recently before the Supreme Court. And, you know, everyone on the Supreme Court basically just like shrugged and was like, what do we know about the internet? You know, like how do you expect us to decide this?
Except Jackson.
And thank God for Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was the only person in the class who did the reading and showed up not shrugging her shoulders and saying, this is so confusing, but just saying, like, we can read, you know, like we can read the case history on this and we can decide this. Like, you don't actually have to know. First of all, you don't actually have to know that much about how social media algorithms work, but also you guys are SCOTUS justices.
Right.
Read, like it's not that hard. Like, like prepare, but like, can we just talk about like how influencer culture is, like not just a little bit, a whole lot implicit in this, like what generally gets called the kind of disinformation culture, right? Like,
so can I just point out that on February 25th, the Slate podcast Amicus Brief devoted its whole show to this court case.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And there was a lawyer on there. Unfortunately, I've forgotten her name, but Lee, you just channeled her, because at some point she basically said, "You're Supreme Court justices. Like, if you can't read,
do your homework.
Have your clerks read."
Yeah.
and at one point she said, like, "I've been studying this for years. Go study."
It's embarrassing.
I would bet money that was probably Melissa Murray, because I listened to that podcast as well.
Yeah, I mean, it might have been. I don't know, but I think the point here is that like we have this problem, which is like these major decisions that are absolutely essential to like how information is being spread and managed and produced, et cetera. And no small part of that is influencer culture.
Sure.
Like major decisions are being made about that by people who are just like, meh, I don't understand it. Let the companies decide.
But Lee, you probably have insight into this in ways that I don't. In order to be an influencer, isn't it the case that you have to sort of get your way to the top, such that all these algorithms are surfacing your content? Because if they weren't, then you wouldn't be an influencer, right? Because you wouldn't have all the views you have and so on. And yet in many ways that's a kind of moving target, and also for almost all social media platforms, it's a black box. And so for me, this is a very confusing thing about how then this influencer works in order to be surfaced all the time on TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or, whatever other social media platform.
I think that's a really good point. Like two things. I think one, and this kind of harkens back to a episode that you and I and Charles did on hustle, like the hustle, right? Like the hustle culture, which is that, becoming an influencer is the new hustle, right? Like right. It's like the way that it's the get rich quick scheme of, the 21st century. But it's not a total mystery, right? Like, I mean, like people do understand how to, like game this, structure. And more importantly, these platforms understand both how to game the structure and how the structure is gamed. And so like for them to step back and say, there's nothing we can do about it, like, this is just how the algorithms work. And then for the Supreme Court, minus Ketanji Brown Jackson, the Supreme Court to say like, man, let's just believe them. It's just like, it's like 1984,
My favorite
like 1884.
My favorite part of that oral argument was the ways in which each of them were striving for an analogy. And like, I think it was Gorsuch at one point is like, isn't the internet like a bookstore? And I'm like, yeah, no.
And then you have somebody like Kavanaugh, frat boy Kavanaugh come in and say like, but can you imagine if they actually had to be held responsible for, like the things that they're doing? It's just I
think you have a book title there for your next project, Hustling the Algorithm.
Yeah, all right. When I get a minute to write a book, like I'm on that. But we should move on. Okay, so we did have another episode that we were going to do a afterthoughts about. I think this is maybe maybe most controversial episode of this season. So, Jason, what did you think about that episode?
So we're talking about 84 Abolition of the Family, yes?
Yeah. So we're
Correct.
talking about our conversation with
Yes.
Sophie Lewis about her
Right.
book, Abolition of the Family. Yeah.
I mean, my number one thought about that episode and about the whole family abolition as a politics is has to do with the distinction between analysis and slogan for organizing. I mean, I think a lot of the stuff that is said about the family, its role in perpetuating, reproducing relations of capitalism, its role in being perpetuating also relations of patriarchy and domination. I think all those things are correct. I don't think that family abolition is ever going to catch on as a political slogan because of, I mean, and there are all kinds of weird reasons for that because of, as we talked about on the episode, that people still are attached to an idealized version of the family, even though almost everyone at least knows someone for whom the family they were born into was a site of, psychological, physical, or other types of violence and abuse. Even though we know the family falls from its ideal, we're still attached to the ideal. I feel like it's one of the points around. I mean, there's a lot of stuff coming out. Another new book coming out about family and family abolition as a politics, and I think it is absolutely right in terms of its analysis, but like not so good in terms of an idea this is ever going to become an organizing slogan. So I think that's where part of the controversy comes from, is that people are like, well, no one's, like it always sounds to many people like a bridge too far to going as far as a certain kind of radicalism. But at the same time, I do think that there are some really good points being made by Sophie Lewis and others about precisely what the family is, and trying to at least sometimes take off our rose-colored glasses when we look at and think about this thing called the family.
Jason, that helps explain to me the sentiment I had in listening back to it, namely that at certain points it seemed like the position Sophie Lewis was outlining was an incredibly radical position. And then at other times, it seemed like she was stepping back from that really radical position, as one or the other of us would say, oh, so then you mean this? And she'd be like, no, I don't really mean that. And I wonder now if I listened for a third time to it, I would see that though the difference between those two sides is precisely this distinction you're pointing out, that one, the radical part is the analytic part. And when I felt her pulling back from that radical part, maybe it was the slogan part.
I thought it was a really provocative conversation. And certainly I kept thinking, there are two quotes about families that I always think about, and that's obviously Tolstoy's, right? All happy families are alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. But I also think about Richard Pryor's great quote that family is like a prison sentence you didn't commit the crime for. And I completely agree with Jason that I'm thinking this. I'm thinking, am I thinking about this the wrong way? But I'm thinking, as a political project, as a social project, this is never going to fly. Because I think it's true. I think all of the analytical interpretation is correct. Family is a site for certain types of exploitation, be it sort of gender, be it sort of capital subject. All that's true. None of that is wrong. But I also think that at this point in history, I don't think we have an idealized version of family. I think there's a level of recognition of the problematics of. That's why it's such a popular trope within, right, mass media. Everybody, I come from a terrible family, a terrible relation with my mother. We all recognize that, but despite that, right, for whatever reasons we find benefit within this particular social structure, we've just agreed to accept this side of it, right, the tragic exploitative side of it, but still sort of rely upon these other, and not even idealize. We can't say that what makes a person happy in their family is necessarily just a fiction. Like there may be people out there that maybe actually enjoy for good or ill, right? The company of this group of people that they were sort of biologically, I want to say inserted into, but I guess that's not a wrong way of putting it. So I just thought that I understand the political side of it, I understand the analytic side of it, but I just think that there's a real soft sort of messy, right? To paraphrase Stuart Hall, right? It's very messy in terms of the actual reality of it, and I don't think people are quite willing to sort of completely separate from that messiness. I think they find that messiness in some ways beneficial and helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I think it was evident in the episode that Sophie and I disagreed about a lot of things. In all fairness to her, like a lot of those disagreements were discussed in more fully in our breaks. But as the editor of the episode, and as just a decent person, like, you can't tell somebody like, this is off the record and then put it in the episode. But I really do wish that like some of those conversations had made it into the episode. I don't think that they would have changed anything about fundamentally what either of us were saying. But I do think that, just to address Jason's point about whether or not abolition of family is a good slogan, I don't think it's a good slogan. I think it's going to be hard to get people on board with the abolition of the family. But I do think that if we want to move people towards some more liberatory notion of care relations, that taking the strategy of an abolition of the family slogan, where an abolition of the family means an abolition of the traditional family, and therefore an embrace of what I was calling the chosen family. And I get it, and I get her reasons for this, that Sophie did not want to like embrace the language of choice. But I mean, for me, I think that like that's the best way, that's the most like realistic sort of like utopian vision that we can have when it comes to liberating people from the strictures of the traditional family.
So you're saying that the slogan "Eat your parents" isn't just going to sell? That's not going to.
I mean, like it's like, it's like Impossible Meat. It'll have a limited market, and I don't know. There are people who are going to want to eat their parents.
And I don't know anything about this new work that Jason referred to that's coming out. Or who is it by, Jason? Oh, you didn't say.
O'Brien is her last name. I can't remember her first name.
So I don't know anything about that, but I was sort of struck in listening back how little contemplation there was of both historically and geographically. There are an incredible number of varying kinship structures that look widely different than the family that was at issue, both in that book and in our conversation. And Lee, I think this would go to your point, like, wouldn't looking at some of these other structures of care, and even based on kinship, but then maybe an expansive kind of kinship and so on, to look at these, wouldn't this be helpful in us thinking about how it is we got where we were with the family, what work it's doing for us, and what work we want care to be doing, and do any of these other kinship structures or other structures of care provide to us? Because I think there are existing models out there already that we just didn't touch on.
Well, let's just talk about the Black family. No, I'm just joking.
No, let's talk about the Black family, because that came up a couple of times as kind of like folded in with the problematic family. And yeah.
I mean, I just think I would have liked for I would have liked for some of the conversation about the ways in which sort of enslaved people were in many ways released from this biological unit that she describes as a family, and had to create what, Lee, you were describing as chosen family, with the creation of fictive kin, with the ways in which sort of people are brought into relationship around common goals, common productive goals, whether it be child rearing or whether it be sort of material acquisition for food or right, all of these things. So I think there are historical examples of there that completely support, I think, what Sophie was trying to say. But I felt that there were, I don't know what their pronouns are, I'm going to say they, them, what they were not broad enough in terms of really engaging the full range and just making very, very specific assumptions about how everyone is constituted family.
Yeah, I also want to say that, after sitting with this for a couple of weeks, like a few weeks, I'm now unconvinced that there is anything like a non-privatized notion of care. Like, it seems to me that care is like just in the history of moral philosophy, like the example that we give of personal relations, and like there is no like generalized care, that is, that is the same across all relations. So so this idea of like marking the family as the unit of privatized care, and then marking the unit of privatized care as a problem, like, seems to me like an impossible, like, Mobius strip. Like, you can't get out of that. I don't know, like, it's like all care is going to be private in some sense.
I guess I would say that maybe there's a distinction we made between particularized care and privatized care. I think that part of the issue that comes in with the word privatized, and at least some of what I think Sophie Lewis is trying to say around that is privatized care, and the care around the sort of family is this ability to not only just care for a particular person, but shut anyone out of that relationship.
Yeah, that's fair.
And I think that particularized care, like, you can care for a particular person, but you can do so in a way. And I agree that in some sense, care is always going to be care for, and this kind of goes back to our hospitality issue. You can't care for like a generic other. You have to care for a specific other or specific person. But I do think that the particularized nature doesn't have to be privatized. It can be within a web of other relations in which people can call you to account on your failure to do that. I think the privatized notion of the family is the ability to shut those doors and to be able to say to the rest of the world, this is none of your business. And that's the thing that I think that Sophie Lewis and others are reacting against, that ability. And of course, and I think it is worth discussing, at least briefly, that, all this discussion of the abolition of the family is happening at the same moment that there is from the right, a massive attempt to extend the reach of the privatized family and to exclude teachers, librarians, etc., of having nothing to say to children and nothing to offer some particular children who might very well need someone outside of their family to hear their concerns, if people in their family or their issues or what they're going through, if their family is hostile to it or deaf to it in some way.
And I know Governor DeSantis is a huge fan of the show, so I hope you hear that, DeSantis.
But the flip side is the danger of not being able to maintain that privatization of family to protect students or children from, the insertion of, alien or governmental bodies. So I'm thinking about, Texas, where now trans kids cannot, receive sort of gender affirming care. So maybe there are important reasons to be able for families, parental units, whatever, to be able to say, no, this is an issue that we're dealing with, and we're going to protect whomever from this alien incursion. That was weird.
I mean, it is an alien incursion. I mean, like that's part of the construction of the traditional family, is like anyone who comes into that private sphere of care is an alien who doesn't belong to be here,
Yeah.
but I mean, as somebody who lives in a state that just passed a law that, basically outlawed gender affirming medical care, I mean, I think this is a really important point to note about, I mean, just, to note about the merits of Sophie's argument, which is like, this is like, there are real things happening right now that are, like testing the limits of, like how much we will extend this privatized sphere of care to literally outlaw like other carers coming in where care is needed or deserved.
Right. If I could just add another point in a completely different direction, I was thinking afterwards that it would have been nice to introduce some historical examples or examples from within the history of philosophy and other disciplines of arguments about or arguments against the family. So going back already to Plato's Republic, right? The children are not raised privately, the children are raised publicly. You have a whole host of French utopian socialists and Scottish utopian socialists who also have thought through this problem in ways that I think are worth thinking about why they want to move away from the family and what they hope to achieve by this non-privatized care. It would have been interesting to bring some of those examples into our discussion.
Yeah, I think like on that very excellent point, maybe it's time for us to wrap up our conversation.
Sounds good.
All right.
Yeah, so I just want to say, like, on behalf of Rick and Jason, that Charles, it's so great to have you back with us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great to be here. Great to see all of your smiling, shiny, happy faces.
Yeah, I'm also going to ask for your absolute commitment that you will be here for our last Afterthoughts episode for season 6. Yeah, great. 100%. Y'all heard that, right?
I heard it
on tape.
Yeah.
Well, and you know where the bar is, Charles, so you're welcome here anytime.
I appreciate that. I definitely appreciate that.
Yeah, Jason, I'm going to let you pitch our Patreon. Our Patreon.
Oh, so yeah. Okay. Caught me off guard there. So
we always got to be ready to sell ourselves.
Sell ourselves. We got to be better influencers. So if you're influenced by us at all, check us out on Patreon/Hotel Bar Sessions. And you can support us at many different levels because podcasting isn't free. Well, it's free to you, but it's not free to do. And we definitely need some support. And if you want to keep hearing conversations like this, and who wouldn't, keep supporting us.
I love that slogan. It's free to you, but it's
free
not
for you.
Free
Yeah.
to do.
There you go. That's a t-shirt.
Yeah. Bam.
All right, guys. Thanks. This has been such a great conversation. I'm so glad to have all four of us back together.
Yeah.
Okay.
See y'all.
All right. Take care.
Bye, everybody.